Next week, we are back in this room for Whose Streets. Please let everyone know. We're going to go ahead and let people know across the board. We'll be screening Whose Streets, a film by Damon Davis and Sabah Jordan. Damon and Sabah will be here. Derica Blackman will be in conversation with them. The movie is going to start, I think, probably earlier than this. We want to be able to show the whole thing and then allow enough time for them to be able to talk about the movie at the end. It might go, 10, 15 minutes over a little bit. You're going to want to hear their story. These are folks who captured the Ferguson movement from the inside. This is by far the most powerful movie that's been done, documentation of any kind that's been done, I'd say, on Ferguson. And they'll be able to tell you about it. They were there for every moment of it all. The following week, I just love this slide. How beautiful is this slide, right? Mutuality, the future of justice movements. Apparently the future is female folks. And this is going to be happening on Thursday. Remember, there's a day shift here. It's going to be happening on Thursday from 6 to 8 p.m. at Cumberly Auditorium, okay? For those of you who are joining us as guests of the community or just as friends of ours, and you want to get a ticket to this, please come up to us afterwards and see us. We'll get your email. We'll work out some sort of a deal. We'll negotiate. We'll figure it all out. We'll get you in there. Don't worry about it. But this is going to be happening on May 18th at 6 to 8 p.m. at Cumberly. And the tickets are going very, very fast. So let your friends know if they've been thinking about it, they should go ahead and sign up for it right away. The following week, we will be in the Bing Auditorium for a special concert with Orquesta Pasatono, Oaxacan, indigenous Oaxacan ensemble, music ensemble, playing with Don Flemons, Americana roots artist. It's going to be an amazing concert. They've never met each other before, but they'll be working it all out on stage. And Ruben Martinez, our artist in residence, will be talking with them about their music, where it comes from, all those kinds of things. We're going to time shift this as well. In order to accommodate the Bing space, we had to move it from 7 to 9 p.m. Okay, so just wanted to make sure that everybody knows that. Again, if you're joining us from the community and you'd like a ticket to this, please let us know. We have very limited tickets for this. All of the public tickets are sold out already. Okay. This is another plug for Stanford Live. The wonderful folks who are hosting us. Remember, there's a dance space thing on May 4th and 15th. And the Claudia Rankin's coming on May 16th. You can get your tickets via this link here, live.stanford.edu/content/art-community-Stanford Live. They set this up just for us. Okay, so upcoming community events. Again, if you have not got your credit for community events that you've attended, please make sure that you see us afterwards. We will be having this talk back about Whose Streets on May 11th. That's the Thursday, May 10th, excuse me. The Thursday following at the Harmony House with lunch, a chance to talk about the movie some more, and to talk about whatever topics folks want to talk about. Raquel de Anda, I'm sorry for the formatting on this, but Raquel de Anda will be doing a workshop with Students for Sustainable Stanford on May 18th. The day after is that right, May 18th? Or is it May 18th, yeah? Okay, right, noontime. That's the Friday? So the event, the Mutuality event is on May 17th, folks. Sorry about that. It's Thursday, May 17th. And then Don Flemons is the following week. We're getting those details together. And Orquesta Pasatono as well. It will be at El Centro on May 24th, the day after the concert. And they'll be bringing their instruments, and we'll be talking more about their music and playing and talking a lot more. And then, of course, gosh, all of the formatting is wrong on this. Tarana Burke, and this is happening on May 29th. It's a Tuesday from 6 to 8 p.m. An evening with Tarana Burke. Alicia Bieria is going to be interviewing her. And that'll be at Cumberly Auditorium. We'll let you know when tickets are going to be available for that. And with that, I will pass it on over to the great Alana.
All right, so I want to invite us into our community practice. And together we'll take a deep breath in. And out with noise. Yeah. time. That was beautiful. One more time. Deep breath in. And out with the way. And we'll just notice that energy in the space. We'll just notice what we created there before we jump into other things. Just noticing if you feel different, feel the same, feel the person next to you if you don't. And so now I just wanted to leave some space for us to kind of think about all the learnings that have happened in this class up until now, these last 5 weeks. So the question that I have for you that I'd love for us to think about individually, but really to break in and talk to the person next to you, talk to the person that you haven't met so far in this class. The question we have for you is, what have you learned so far in this class that feels important for other people to hear? What have you learned so far in this class that feels important for other people to hear? And so this is, again, I was reading something and I thought it was a very perfect kind of intention for this class. They say that people who think the same and move the same, so people who think the same and are moving the same direction, that's called a cult. But people who are thinking differently but are moving in a similar purpose, that's called a movement. So the idea of this class is not to funnel us into one kind of mode of thought, but to really think and expand and explore how we can open up and create spaces for multiple forms of thought and expression to exist in one space in a way that feels like it holds us all. So with that intention, what have you learned so far in these 5 weeks in Art and Community that you feel is important to be heard? Find someone that you don't know yet. It might be hard because y'all have been intermingling. So find someone you don't know and we'll talk about those questions together. And we'll give about 2 or 5 minutes to do it.
I certainly think that there was a level of critique that, and I don't think.
All right. We don't have a handheld mic today, so we're gonna have to. All right, everybody. Cool. I mean, this feels really good. Just to hear everybody talking amongst each other feels super good. So we don't have a handheld mic this week. So we're going to use our theater voices and deeply project in this space, all right? So just to remind us of our community practices, this is the question, but to remind us of our community practices, we'll just start by stating our name so that we know how to address you and know who you are, and then say what you have to say. Cool? And we're warm up now, so folks I'm sure have a lot of things to share. So I just would like to open it up and just, does anybody want to respond? Oh, cool. Does anybody want to respond to the question? What do you feel like you've learned this quarter so far that is important for others to hear? And what we're doing here is just to kind of illuminate things and just kind of recap together, all together, and community. So here we go.
Cool. Be concerned with who your art is impacting, who your art is made for, and who your art is made with, and how it's like making a positive difference in your community, or at least the communities around you. Thank you.
So as we bridge from last week to this week, I wanted to offer just a little bit more around transformative justice, which we know is a strategy for addressing harm and conflict in a way that doesn't reproduce systems of harm and reproduce more harm and more conflict. So bringing in 2 more teachers. First, the artist and healer, Louisa Tish. And she says, anything you want to be spared of, you must work towards diminishing the possibility of it happening to you. And if it can happen to somebody else, it can happen to you. So I can't afford to just walk around worried that I individually am going to be locked up for no reason. I have to make sure that nobody can be locked up for no reason. I have to eliminate the fear not only in myself, but the real basis for that fear. And that's from Louisa Tish. And second, from Adrienne Marie Brown. We are touching the future, reaching out across boundaries and post-apocalyptic conditions to touch each other, to call each other out as family, as beloveds. All that you touch, you change. All that you change, changes you. That's Octavia Butler. We are making ourselves vulnerable enough to be changed, which will, of course, change what our existence means. We are creating a world we have not seen because of our ancestors, because of us, because of the children we are raising. We are working towards a future without police or prisons. If we are to do that, we must address harm in ways that allow for the transformation of any situation and not just adding more harm. To transform the conditions of the wrongdoing, we have to ask ourselves and each other why, especially when we are scared of the answer. It's easy to decide a person or a group is shady, evil, psychopathic. It's harder to ask why. When we ask why, we move attention away from the individual and toward the system. We work to dismantle systems and not each other. We are living inside the results of other people's imaginations. People who couldn't imagine Black people being free, fat girls being sexy, disabled people being leaders. People who could only imagine their own power and dominance. When more people imagine together and then step from imagining into thinking through the structures and protocols of a society together, then more needs are attended to. That is the work of transformative justice. That is the true work that we must begin. And so I want to leave you with thinking through this question, and also even leave a really brief space if anybody wants to share anything that came up from last week or as you're thinking into this week around these ideas. So the last question is, who must we become in order to participate in and activate the world we are working so hard to create? Who must we become in order to participate in and activate the world we are working so hard to create? And I think that transformative justice pushed us really far into thinking about these ideas. And so we welcome any conversation that you want to have about them in this public space, but also in the private spaces afterwards. And with that, I think the guests that we have this week will kind of bring us further into these ideas and more of their own. So with that, I'd like to welcome Jeff, who will welcome our guests, and welcome to week 5.
Let me just get this on really quickly. All right, so I'm going to try to be really short here today so we can get straight to our guests. I wanted to just sort of recap some of the main ideas that we've talked about so far. All communities are made from radical difference, right? Community is built through reciprocity and sustained by justice. And we also wanted to sort of talk through a new concept that came up in your reading about language recovery for this week from the State of Alaska, Alaska Native Language Preservation 2018 report. And that is this idea of cultural justice. Right? So when we think about cultural justice, you can think about it, we're talking about all these different ideas about justice, right? Again, justice being this idea of what do we owe to each other? So we can think about cultural justice as maybe working in 2 different kinds of ways. You can think about justice through culture. How do we express justice through culture? And this is the work that we've been doing up to this particular point in this class today, thinking about transformative justice. So Mia Mingus's idea about transformative justice, seeking to stop violence, secure safety, and take accountability for harm, prevent future violence and harm by actively cultivating practices such as healing, accountability, and resilience for all. So justice through culture, and culture being present in this idea of practices, right? What are the practices that we are advancing, that we're reaffirming, that we're continuing, that we're sustaining in order to express justice? And then justice between cultures, which is what Annette Evans-Smith was talking about in this particular report on language recovery, right? That cultural justice in that context is the reclamation of traditional and cultural forms of practice, and we could also add knowledges, right? So thinking about how we express justice between cultures. Now, this word culture is a really, really difficult type of word, but it's important for us to kind of understand all the ways that it's being used. So we're talking about here as justice being expressed through culture, right? Culture being the place where justice is expressed. And over here, justice between cultures. So people holding these different cultures, groups holding these different types of cultures, right? And let's get at that idea in a meta kind of way, that culture is the dynamic force that's at the heart of community. Culture is what brings community together. So you can think about, in the US, there's laws, in the state, there's laws, in Canada there's laws, I think, too, yeah? We're going to talk about that today. Canada, right? There's laws in Canada? Okay. Just want to make sure. It always seems like things are so much better in Canada. Canada has laws, too. That's definitive now. But laws, judges, judgments, right? These are the things that define the boundaries of society. Culture is what defines the norms, right? What brings the things together. Culture shapes the norms that we live by, the common sense wisdom that we actually work by from a day-to-day type of basis. It's the dynamic force at the heart of communities. So we always have the power to shape it, to move it, to change it. We have agency, right? To be able to determine what culture is. It sets the terms that bring us together, the practices, the knowledges. We can talk about an inclusive culture and exclusive culture. And so today what we want to try to do is to look at this idea of cultural recovery and cultural renewal. So cultural recovery already says that we've got suppressed ideas, suppressed cultures, suppressed cultural knowledges. And so we're going to talk about how memory is revived, how cultural practices are brought back into circulation, why it's important to do that, right? And how these practices can then grow and evolve the community and bring it into a renewal, not just the communities that are impacted right away, but the larger types of communities, right? So culture and the larger culture, right? People's cultures and then more people's cultures out of that. So with that, I want to introduce to you our guests. Let me pull these chairs out here. We're going to first introduce, Stacy Jessamine, coming to us from Victoria, British Columbia today. Yes. Stacy Jessamine is an international transactional and dispute resolution attorney and specialist in art and cultural heritage law. As senior counsel at JFK Law in British Columbia, she assists Indigenous clients with cultural heritage and economic development matters, including repatriating stolen heritage, Black Panther, anybody remember this scene from Black Panther, right? And crafting laws and policies, I guess that makes you Killmonger, the British Columbian Killmonger. And crafting laws and policies on heritage resources and ancestral remains. Stacy holds BA degrees in art, honor, I don't know where that came from. Art history and international relations from Stanford, a JD from the University of Toronto, and an LLM from the University of British Columbia. She also has been teaching a class, Indigenous Cultural Heritage, with Karen Beesman, and you may be teaching it next year, yeah? Yeah, so sign up for that. Please welcome Stacy Jessamine Day. Stacy Jessamine. Yes. I want to bring up to the stage Eugene Rodriguez, who received a master's degree in classical guitar performance from the San Francisco Conservatory of Music. He's a U.S. Artist Oliver Fellow. That's a really big deal, actually. And he formed Los Senzoles in 1989, the youth group, through an artist residency from the California Arts Council. In 1991, he established the Fandango Project to promote participatory music and dance in the Bay Area with support from the U.S.-Mexico Fund for Culture. And then he incorporated Los Senzoles, the Art Center in San Pablo, Los Senzoles Mexican Arts Center in 1994. Los Senzoles is a band, it's a cultural center, it's just a movement, folks. And in 1995, the band was nominated for a Grammy for Best Musical Album for Children. He's worked with artists like Linda Ronstadt, Ry Cooder, David Hidalgo, Taj Mahal, Raul Malo, Elvin Bishop, and has collaborated with the Chieftains and Los Lobos and made 18 CDs for Los Senzoles. He's played really a pioneering role in the revival of Mexican folk music here in California. and innovated adaptations of traditional pedagogy to suit urban contexts in the contemporary present. Please welcome Eugene Rodriguez. And last but definitely not least, Brandon B. Mike Odoms. Native of New Orleans, street artist and activist. B. Mike is a visual storyteller. He's worked as a visual artist and a filmmaker. His work is displayed throughout the city of New Orleans, including his first solo show in a place called Studio B. We're going to talk about Studio B today. He also did before that a project called Project B, which he's going to talk about, and also Exhibit B. He's the founder and director of 2 Cent Entertainment, a New Orleans-based youth education social enterprise that produces mixed media content and workshops in the overlap between pop culture and social awareness. His music videos have appeared on MTV, VH1, and BET, and his murals can be seen in Detroit, Harlem, South Korea, and Palestine. B. Mike. So Stacey, why don't you come up and lead us through thinking about indigenous cultural recovery and renewal.
Okay, great. Okay, thank you very much, Jeff. Thank you for inviting me, Alon and Jeff. It's a no, you can't.
I'm just going to move it to the next slide for you.
Okay, good.
Yeah, there you go.
It's fun.
Yeah, we can move to the side.
It's fun to be back on campus. So I was teaching here last year a course on illicit trade in art and antiquities, and I hope we'll be teaching here next winter. It's a plug for the course on Indigenous cultural heritage. But tonight, I'm going to talk a little bit about what I do as an academic, but also as a lawyer, because what I'm hoping to do is to give you some ideas about ways to make change in the world and empower you and make you feel like you can go out and make a difference through careers, maybe in law. So I'm going to talk about what I do. So in the cultural recovery realm, I'm teaching courses on these subjects of Indigenous heritage, repatriation and protection, and the history of the taking, so that there is an understanding of how the material was removed. As a lawyer, I'm also, through direct negotiation, helping communities repatriate their stolen objects, their songs, their intangible heritage too, from museums who hold these collections. And I'm also doing that work through treaty negotiations. So I sit across the table from governments, provincial and federal governments, and negotiate what I hope are successfully negotiate innovative and new ways of approaching these subjects. So in Canada, we've been negotiating treaties for 20, 30 years, but they're usually always the same. And one of the reasons I took this job and went home last year was to try and revolutionize the way we do this work in Canada, because we have a new government, provincially and federally, and I thought this is a great opportunity. Let's go and try and make some concrete change and get the heritage back into the hands of the people to whom it really belongs. So I'm trying to help my clients negotiate these treaties with the museums and have the museums rethink what they should be doing on a long-term basis with Indigenous peoples, giving them access, involving them in research around repatriating anything that was taken without free, prior, and informed consent, illicitly taken, and working to have them rethink the way they got collections. So if you got them from a missionary, well, how did the missionary get them out of the hands of the people that he took them from? And then also force the governments to think about their collections of intangibles, their stories and songs that are in their collections. So that's what I'm doing as a lawyer. I'm also working a lot with Indigenous communities and individuals, helping them start businesses and structuring joint ventures with resource companies and ways to get money into the communities and help them become independent on an economic basis, so that they can sever the dependence that was forced on them by the government through laws and policies over the last 100 years, become economically independent and thriving. That'll create wellness for them and the funds to recover their cultural material. So it's all about making communities healthy and thriving and get them on the road to recovering and reviving their cultures and languages. And I see economic development as a really important part of that. So that's what I'm doing as a business lawyer. So I just want to start with a few definitions. So Jeff asked me to talk about what is art. So art, the word doesn't even exist, right, in a lot of indigenous language, the word art. But if we want to think about it, just in a practical sense, when we're talking about returning art and heritage, there's a couple different ways of talking about it. Tangible forms in a Canadian Indigenous setting would be ceremonial and sacred regalia. So for potlatch ceremonies, which are ceremonies on the West Coast, masks and rattles and hats that are worn during the ceremonies. And then across the nation, we've got pipes and medicine bags, wampum belts. And then other cultural material that's taken by missionaries and anthropologists and collectors, like totem poles. You see them in museums around the world. House poles, you see those in museums too. There's a lot of boxes you see in museums. Those are bent wood boxes. They held everything from food to sacred regalia during ceremonies. Baskets, everyday practical things, but they were taken en masse by collectors who thought that, their cultures are dead, we'll just take everything. And then there's also intangible material, languages, songs and stories, and anthropologists were going out and recording elders and community members, and these recordings are in all of the museums across Canada. Problem is that a lot of Indigenous communities don't know where they are. They don't have the resources or time. They've got a lot of other issues to deal with, and they need to know where they are. So I attended a conference last March in Kelowna. It was an international repatriation conference, and this fantastic cultural practitioner, Simshian, stood up and he sang, and then he said, looked at the museum directors and he said, where's our stuff and how do we get it back? Like, where is our stuff and how do we get it back? The museums know, and so part of my job I see is in negotiating treaties is to force them to come up with a list of what's in their collections, and on an intangible basis too, because they know they have it all there, and repatriate that too. Repatriate the knowledge as well as the objects. So I just wanted I don't want to essentialize because there's so many different native indigenous cultures around the world, right? You can't essentialize, but I just wanted to talk about a vision of within many, many native cultures of culture. So all of these forms that we're seeing here of culture need to be understood holistically as being completely interrelated, right? Everything's related. The land is related, to the resources, is related to the religion and the art and the politics, and everything's seen as interrelated. You can't separate one from the other because they're all interdependent. And so when you're talking about returning culture, you're talking about returning not just objects. You're talking about returning essential parts of a community and making it well again by treating that object or that song as interrelated with everything. And the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, if you read through it, does a really good job of portraying sort of objects and ancestral remains holistically and seeing them as interrelated. So I just wanted to frame it that way. And then they also just understand that this art was all, there were very few exceptions, a few gifts, yes, but most of what's in museums right now, I hate to ruin it for you, but most of it is taken without free prior and informed consent. Whether it was by missionaries who were using psychological tactics to convert people to Christianity and saying that practices and use of objects was heathen, whether it was by anthropologists and collectors who didn't get the right consent before they took things. Maybe they thought they were in a deserted community but didn't understand it was a fishing community. So there's so many, and then there was lots of just very pernicious cultural genocide going on with the government and churches putting children in residential schools as early as the age of 4, forcing them, removing them from their parents, keeping them there for at least 10 to 12 months of the year without letting them see their parents, and preventing them from using their languages and traditions. So there's just a lot of the material that's in the museum needs to be rethought how it got there. And so this is a collector. His name's George Ridley. He was a missionary up in Haisla Territory on the northwest coast. And he was one of these people that made people go down and put their stuff on the beach, and then he collected a lot of it. A lot of it ended up at the Museum of Anthropology in British Columbia. And they've actually refused to return this collection to the Haisla, who repeatedly asked for it, even though George Ridley was known as someone who was, had some pretty hard tactics to get all of this material out of the hands of the community members. So, so what theories underlie my work? So the truth-telling, it's essential to healing. Healing can't happen unless there's truth, right? And so I want to briefly discuss the Truth and Reconciliation Commission that Canada went through over the last decade as an important part of that healing process. Recovering intangible and tangible material, like I said, and revitalizing languages are essential to wellness. Sustainable economic development helps support that cultural recovery and renewal. And I really hope the students come away from the lecture, but at my courses, empowered to feel they know now more about the ways that return and recovery can happen, and they can go out and make a difference. So the residential school was it was now deemed to be cultural genocide. It existed over a 100-year period. The last one closed in 1996 in Canada. They were established in the late 19th century. It was actually based on the Indian boarding school system in the United States. At the schools, as many of you probably know, there was not only cultural genocide, there was also a lot of sexual abuse, physical abuse, psychological abuse, forced sterilizations. It was a terrible system that deeply traumatized almost every child that went through the system. There were the government admits to 8,000 missing and murdered children. Some claim 50,000 missing and murdered children. And it culminated all of that sexual abuse, especially in a class action in Canada against the government and the churches, which in 2006 was settled. And out of that settlement came the creation of this Truth and Reconciliation Commission. So there were 3 commissioners. Justice Sinclair is in the middle there with the glasses on. And over 9 years, they assembled a repository of evidence of what went on in the schools. They held 7 national events there in major cities. 9,000 residential school survivors gave evidence, including some of them publicly. And I participated actually in the Vancouver National event, and where we witnessed survivors speaking about it, and then walked through the city in the pouring rain with 75,000 Indigenous and non-Indigenous Canadians in solidarity with the survivors. So the TRC produced a final report in 2015 and called Honoring the Truth, Reconciling for the Future, and it officially recognized the system as cultural genocide. Having collected over 6,700 statements from survivors, it made clear that for reconciliation to happen, there has to be awareness of the past, acknowledgement of the harm that has been inflicted, atonement for the causes, and action to change behavior. Now, it came up with 94 calls to action, they called them, and recommended legal, governmental, and social mechanisms to create dialogue and respectful engagement. And several of these focus on culture, and they include providing sufficient funds for Aboriginal language and cultural revitalization. And this is important, that these are best managed by Aboriginal people and communities. One of them also talked about fully implementing the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Now, since 2016, our new federal government under Justin Trudeau has committed to implementing that and has removed its reservations and is committed to going forward and doing that. And then it also provided funding to museums, the Canadian Museums Association, to undertake, in collaboration with Indigenous peoples, a national review of museum policies and best practices. And so the UNDRIP, I won't go through these because you can look at them yourself, but the UNDRIP has several important articles talking about return of objects, ceremonial sacred objects, ancestral remains, putting the control over culture and traditions into the hands of Indigenous peoples. revitalizing languages and histories, and ensuring that Indigenous peoples can maintain, control, and protect their knowledge and traditional expressions. So that if you go through the document, you'll see a lot of really important provisions on culture. So the CMA, the Canadian Museums Association, created this new project. Jameson Brandt is on the left there. She's a Turtle Clan member, and she's heading up the project. It's one of the important things that's going on in the Canadian Museum front. Now, the Royal BC Museum also came up with a couple of initiatives. One of them is this really remarkable language exhibition called Our Living Languages. Now, BC has 64 languages up and down the coast, all different, and it's a display and interactive, and you can listen, and it's really great. It's won some important awards. They also have a repatriation project headed by Lucy Bell, that's working to repatriate not only its own collections, but help communities get their heritage and objects back from museums around the world. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about why it's important. So Jeff asked me to think, like, what's important about cultural recovery? Well, in my graduate work, I worked a lot with two First Nations, the Haisla and the Kwakwaka'wakw, who are both on the northwest coast, and I did a lot of interviewing. You know, why is this repatriation, your work you're doing, important? And they came up with, repeatedly said several things that kept coming up. I don't know why my numbering is, but anyway, there are 7. Right and wrongs. So, like I said, they're Indian residential school system. So, like in the United States, the cultural ceremonies were banned. So you couldn't practice them until 1950. It was illegal, and if you were caught, as happened to the Kwakwaka'wakw, you were imprisoned. And so healing trauma, the abuse of the residential schools, making yourself whole and your community whole again, transmitting histories and stories, reinvigorating languages and cultural practices. And then also what was really important to them was that we want to create healthy long-term relationships with museums. We want to be involved. If we don't have a place to bring our objects home, we want to have good relationships with the museum. So what I'm doing at the treaty table is trying to create a way for them to have healthy relationships. This is sort of pictures of what was taken from the Kwakwaka'wakw in 1922 when they were caught potlatching, 700 objects. And this is the residential school that's right in Alert Bay, right near where that potlatch happened. It's a massive school that they actually tore down because of all of the abuse that happened there. They decided as a community to tear it down, which is irrelevant to the discussion of what you're doing with monuments in the United States. If you think about it, they decided to tear it down. This is a pole that was removed from Haisla territory when they were away fishing and taken to Sweden. So what's really neat about this Haisla story is that they used this 15-year negotiation process to really reinvigorate practices in their own community. So they had this group of artists, and you can see the granddaughter of the artist right above her. They carved 2 replica poles together and gave one to the museum and got the original back. And there you can see the original pole standing up, but you can see the replica lying down there. And so, do I have any more time? No? Okay, well, I've already talked about why economic development work is important. It's just important to get economic development work right, because it really helps fund this cultural recovery. So,
Thank you.
Okay.
I wanted to bring up Eugene actually now. Eugene as a musician and as the director of Los Sensontles. Thanks.
I chose the name Sensontle because of a poem from a 15th century native poet, Sensontle. I love the song of the mockingbird, bird of 400 voices. I love the color of jade and the intoxicating scent of flowers. But more than all, I love my fellow man. Los Sensontles is a musical group, a cultural arts academy for neighborhood children, and a production studio run by the people from our neighborhood who grew up in our program. Through the struggle of building and maintaining this thriving organism for nearly 30 years, I know the traps in our system, both ancestral traps from Mexico and traps here in the United States. Our program was forged along with and in response to the greatest demographic shift in modern American history, the mass migration of Mexicans to the United States. This shift that created historic and dangerous backlash. And in this process, I've learned many lessons and I have a lot of stories. Our work of cultural renewal can perhaps be better described as cultural continuum. We work to understand our place in the trajectory of time, learn from our elders and our histories, recognize our responsibilities now, and prepare our children to take their role in society and in our living heritage. Why culture? Culture is one of the most powerful forces we have. At its core, culture is the negotiation between individuals and groups. It is the constant back and forth that exists between people. It is the many codes of communication through which we see each other, see ourselves, and see the world. We all come into this world with capacity and heritage. We all have power. To know that capacity and power, we must know what got us here, what our strengths are, and what our weaknesses are. We use this knowledge to cultivate and use our voices and bodies consciously and strategically to navigate our ways in a constantly changing world. It is through cultural negotiation that we become visible. There are powerful forces around us that try to convince us that we come from nothing and that we are nothing without what they're selling. They sell us a product, a politic, an education, an identity, a social status, whatever. If we know ourselves and our worth, we are in a stronger position to negotiate our goals. The Mexican people were conceived in the trauma of the Spanish conquest. The trauma had two hands, the military dominating our bodies, the clergy dominating our souls. Colonialism set up complex systems designed to control us, and the worst and most destructive of those systems work to undermine how we see ourselves. Culture has always been a tool of control. Put a church where a temple stood, disallow native languages, repurpose cultural practices to serve that which controls us, establish and perpetuate systems, bureaucracies that diminish and humiliate the capacities and contribution of working people. The majority of Mexican Americans came from Mexico's working poor. My family did. My mother tells me that as a child working in the fields, that live music in her family offered moments of lightness in an otherwise heavy existence. So that's the power of cultural arts. It provides us the opportunity to find space within ourselves where there is joy, emotion, love, connection, and perhaps a momentary feeling of freedom. That is why there are so many forces that want to control it. And so that's why culture also has to be a tool for self-definition, negotiation, and even liberation. This is why I formed Los Insultables. In the United States, we have more chance at social mobility than in Mexico. But there are many deeply biased systems of control, including paternalism, that keep us silent and invisible. Rooted in the myth of American identity, Mexican Americans have always been treated as strangers in our own land, as impure people in the land of the Puritans. We are treated as pawns by the right and by the left in the culture wars. Los Insultables is a humble, transformative place. An ex-liquor store in a storefront in a nondescript strip mall on San Pablo Avenue in San Pablo, Richmond. Built by our families like a Mexican version of an Amish barn building, it is a glorious space because of the transformation that happens inside. It is a space within which we can find and cultivate space within ourselves, the power that a child finds in their bodies when they learn to use their voices, their hands, to express themselves and connect with others. The creativity and creation where musical recordings and videos are born, and the personal and social connections of performances and celebrations in our space. And all of this is not based on a product that someone else is selling to us. It is based on what is already ours, our intangible heritage, and our many connections to the world. So what makes Los Insultables unique? It is run by people from our community, whereas most nonprofits are run by professionals from outside the community. We created our own pedagogy based on authentic community culture with community elders in a world driven by top-down gentrified culture. At our academy, our children are not involved. At our academy, our children are not invited scholarship students. They are the hosts who graciously invite others in. We speak in first voice about our experiences, whereas most media and journalism is spoken in third voice about us. We negotiate on our own behalf. We do not passively wait for advocates to save us. We actively cultivate partnerships with others. Los Insoles goes beyond resistance. Los Insoles builds resilience. I find humility, inspiration, and energy in seeing my life as part of a long continuum. So I renew myself by trying to understand what and who brought me here. Do my best to carry forth the best of myself and work to share my knowledge with young people, building their confidence in themselves to carry it forward in their lives. Often the most difficult, important, courageous, and radical thing that we can do is to be ourselves. And it's culture that makes that possible. Thank you. Thank you.
I want to bring up B-Mike here to talk about your project.
So I've been creating in spaces in New Orleans that's been abandoned and forgotten since Hurricane Katrina. Hurricane Katrina went into the city, as some of you may know, and it basically changed the space. There was a lot of abandoned, forgotten spaces in the midst of communities of color, in the midst of spaces where people were trying their best to rebuild and continue. And in these spaces, I started to just paint and find voice in working on the walls. And after I went into this particular space, it was the Florida Housing Projects in the 9th Ward, other artists began to come into the space as well and create and find the wall as a certain type of canvas that helped us process the trauma of displacement, helped us process the trauma of feeling like your story wasn't being told. It was just amazing to see in real time as this project began to take shape. It was all illegal. It wasn't supposed to happen. It wasn't intended to be like this project, or we didn't walk in with this plan or this manifesto, but the people demanded it become something, so it became something. And it became this space of healing. It became this space of expression. And it was just beautiful to see it grow. So this slide kind of just tells the story of all those projects. So it blew up in the way where the city started to take notice. It was on the front page of the paper, and it became this thing that people were curious about and wanted to know more about. And this was a bunch of teachers who went out there. Everyone was breaking the law. We were just inviting people to be lawbreakers. But at this point, for me as a visual artist, as a person who's from New Orleans and understand in terms of what that culture represents, this culture of like alchemy, this culture of transforming pain into beauty, we found ourselves in a very crucial moment. And while this was growing, there was a lot of resistance in the process. Here we were about to get arrested for criminal damage of property, and the property that was for 8 years straight no one was paying attention to. This was a response from that project. The windows and doors were boarded up in a very aggressive way to like silence this amazing thing, in my opinion, that was happening. James Baldwin said artists are here to disturb the peace. This idea of like piercing through this perception of truth that's often projected into the world, and how artists have this responsibility to, as Paul Robeson said, be the gatekeeper of truth. And what does that mean to be the gatekeeper of truth? What does it mean to tell truth using culture? And I think that's what was just talked about so well before me, is this idea that culture naturally is that. It's this authentic voice, it's an authentic representation of who you are. And we were doing it in ways, in spaces that were purposely being silent, spaces that were purposely being washed away. We were articulating and affirming our identity. And a lot of people, at least those at the top, didn't really like or understand, but everyone else seemed to really appreciate. So anyway, I found myself painting in this other space, that was closer to where I was raised. It was in this area of New Orleans called Algiers, and was in there painting for a minute and didn't want to like get caught, but I did, and I talked my way out of it by basically pitching this project where we would make the space public. By some miracle, the owner of the property was like, yo, that's pretty cool, let's do that. And so I invited all those other artists that I had met organically in that previous project, and we began this endeavor of transforming a portion of this space. And it was over 35 artists from the city that I reached out to and said, okay, we're gonna transform this space. And these were all artists that didn't really fit into the traditional spaces, the galleries, the museums. We kind of were the ones that were in the streets painting. And the challenge I gave them was, once again, this conversation of truth, this conversation of saying, you know, these walls aren't blank, these canvases aren't blank, but somehow we have to collaborate with the stories that are already present. We have to collaborate with the ideas and the people who lived here. And that's what we did, at least that's what we tried to do. And with that, you know, that idea of truth, once again, I think it was Dr. Cornel West who was quoting someone else when he said the condition of truth is to allow suffering to speak. This idea that you can't speak truth unless somehow in your words embodies the pain and bruises of everyday people. And that was part of the direction I gave the artists. Like, we have to speak truth. We have to acknowledge where we are. Because we knew people were gonna come from afar to see this space, and we wanted to confront them with the fact that you were literally standing in a housing project and you're happy. Like, you would not have been here had it been what it was before. So we wanted to be truthful about that. But within this idea of what we were doing, or what we were trying to do, was basically just articulate who we were in the space of the city that was projecting to the world that everything was okay. A city that was saying, you know, New Orleans is the Big Easy, we moved on, everything is good, Katrina happened then, and everything is great. We were trying to affirm and say, this is our story, and this is the spaces in which we used to occupy that we can no longer occupy. So anyway, so from these projects, the growth that continued to happen as far as the types of response from the community, the truth was definitely something that was reciprocal in a way. We opened our doors for this particular project, which was called Exhibit B. We had one Saturday that we opened, and on that day, over 2,500 people came out. We were so excited to see all the types of people that came in to see the space, people from all backgrounds, all ages, individuals who intimately knew that space, those who had never once crossed that side of the river, because this is on the west bank of New Orleans. It's a Mississippi River that cuts the city in half. A lot of people don't go to the west bank. And so here we were in this space. This was a couple that met out there that was super excited to show people around. They became like their own tour guides, like, this is where we met and all this stuff. But it was super dope to see the response and to see the way we were like not the only. It was a dope environment. For example, one would come into the space and be like, yo, my grandparents lived here, they need to be on this wall. And we were like, yeah, let's do that. And they were on the wall. I don't know how many times you can go to a museum and be like, yo, where I'm at, I need to be there. That's what we were doing. That's what's so dope about this project. And then we also we did school tours, we invited the kids to create in the space. And so you're gonna add your voice to this project as well. They were all discarded tires, we transformed. And so anyway, it was this brilliant group of volunteers that made this possible. And I think the most beautiful moment of this 3 months that we remained open was the last day. It was on MLK Day, a very fitting day to close this beautiful project. And we told the people, we said, this is your last chance to see it. We're gonna have a block party, it's gonna be pretty dope, you should come out. And this is what the response was. And the police said we had to shut it down. If we had too many people, it was like either close the gate or shut it down. So I closed the gate, and people like hopping the fence to get in. It was pretty wild. But it was just this dope vibe of just this connectedness, this community, this idea of healing using the art, healing using culture. In New Orleans, brass band culture is huge, so my alma mater brass band came in. Trombone Shorty, Erykah Badu. It was a super dope. What? I got a background doing music videos and stuff, so I was like making phone calls, yo, please come through. But anyway, so the idea of like culture in New Orleans is like, the culture table was full, which is a good problem to have as a city. You know, as far as public art, we didn't really have a seat at the table, because public art to us was like brass bands and parades. But as a muralist, you know, it took for these projects for us to finally like have a seat at the table and for people to understand how valuable it was to see themselves reflected in the spaces as they were changing. Because in New Orleans, we're still dealing with this idea that communities are changing, like most chocolate cities are dealing with, right? This idea of gentrification and the identities of communities are changing. But in New Orleans, it's such a violent act that's happening, not like it's not in other places. But in New Orleans, a neighborhood like the Treme, I don't know if this name sounds familiar, but there was a TV show on Showtime called Treme. There's a neighborhood in New Orleans called Treme, right? Treme is the home of like Louis Armstrong and all these great jazz musicians. A friend of mine who's one of the current genius of the Treme named Trombone Shorty. And I remember we had a conversation recently and he was like, you know what, dude, I might be the last one from that neighborhood to come out and do what he's doing. Because right now the Treme is like Disneyland. It's like Airbnbs and bread and breakfast. And it's no longer community. So we're facing in New Orleans in the face of like this threat to the culture, this wiping away of what it was. Public art is slowly becoming this reminder in a very assertive way, at least that's the way I treat it, the way I paint in the city of New Orleans, a reminder of what it was and a reminder of what it should be. This is now my solo show in New Orleans called Studio B. It's a 35,000 square foot warehouse where fully intentional all the lessons I learned from those organic projects in a way in which we keep the space open 4 days a week, and we treat it like a museum, but in a way it's a cultural space. It's a space we come together, we have events and things like that. But this is cool. These some kids who went to the school tour.
Like perseverance, because love can
They're
help.
talking about what they learned at the studio.
And we learned a lot of things about friendship. And you cannot drive out hate with hate. You can only drive out hate with love. And something else I learned was to be yourself. Don't try to be like somebody you're not. Be yourself. And what I learned that you cannot have fear. You can only have love and friendship.
You can turn it down.
I learned.
So, this is on Malcolm X's birthday, and they wanted to say happy birthday to Malcolm X, and so they did this video. And but yeah, so it's amazing moments like this that happens all the time in the studio. But what's so amazing about these moments is that it's a reminder, like you said, like the idea of of culture showing how valuable you are. And one of my favorite moments in Studio B was when we did this school tour, and there was this young man who was walking through this middle school. He was like 13, and I asked him, I was like, how do you feel about the space? He's like, oh, I like it. I said, what's your favorite piece? And he pointed at this painting on his wall of this young man, and on his shirt it said Alchemist. And he said, I like that one. I said, why do you like that one? He said, because it looks like me. And for that moment, I realized like that experience I never had growing up in art school. I never went to a space where I was like, oh, I see myself reflected, or I see my story reflected. And I think that's what we're trying to do in this space. The last mural I did in New Orleans, or the latest one I did in New Orleans, I just finished like a couple weeks ago, and it's a portrait of Buddy Bolden and his band. And it's right in the middle of the business district of New Orleans. If you don't know who Buddy Bolden is, Buddy Bolden was hands down, or arguably, the inventor of jazz music. He was 2 generations removed from slavery. His father was the driver for his grandfather's former master. So he was literally still almost born in the same environment that his grandfather as a slave was born in. But he was the genius that took ragtime, blues, traditional sacred music, and fused it into jazz, right? And here it was, the very space that this happened, the very street, the very block that this occurred on, is now like the booming. I'm sorry, this is gonna be mad distracting, but I'm gonna just talk about it. But if you got a question about anything, you see, we can talk about it later. But now in the midst of where the painting, the wall that I painted, that space is now like the business district. It's like full of skyscrapers. Not really, New Orleans is not that big a city, but it's like big buildings and stuff. And so painting his portrait on this wall was a way to force people to remember and to remind them of how sacred the ground was that this space is, that this young man, this genius created a form of music that transformed the world, and yet his story is not really known. Like he's kind of like a mythical tale. Like there's no recorded music from him. He spent the last 30 years of his life in an insane asylum because he literally, like, his level of genius, one can argue, there's the other side of that, we're seeing that from a certain person right now. But anyway, so it's been amazing to basically find, this process has been about finding my voice as an artist, understanding the why I create, and to understanding how important and how powerful art is. especially when you maintain your truth and you hold on to the idea of why it's important, or why it's important for people to see themselves reflected in spaces that they don't normally, especially in their home. That's one way in which I could have explained these last 5 years. There's other layers to it. This is a project, a collaboration with Nike that I did around their equality campaign, which is pretty dope. But yeah, so I think I can end there. So appreciate it.
Each of you, your work has to do with communities that have been violently displaced or erased, suppressed, and restoring a sense of wholeness. I think the way that you had referred to it, Stacey, was this restoring a sense of wholeness to the individual and to the people within it. You didn't get into it, Eugene, but the catalyst for starting the Cultural Arts Center was an act of violence that was done to a person in the community, and you're feeling that you needed to kind of address that in some sort of a way, and then be like moving into these projects that were abandoned. They were fenced off. They weren't abandoned. People still lived there, but people were removed from these places, scattered, and literally these fences were put around them. People could not move back in, despite the fact that in many cases these were sound structurally. There were entire communities. There was a complete erasure, going back to Stacey's presentation of folks, and so bringing back folks into the community was so key. And in the same way, Los Anzones is a place for people to try to find their wholeness. And the other thing I was struck about too was, in all the cases, there's a really strong thread that wholeness relates to intergenerationality. That there's a piece that's about honoring the elders and the knowledge that they hold, and that is often being erased or suppressed. In the case of language, entire generations of language users losing language, right, in the native case. So this notion of sort of wholeness being found through this coming back to community in all the generations, and this beautiful sort of way in which people are interacting. You're going to say something?
Yeah, I want to say something. Yeah, I think it's really timely. And then you're right. So when we started off, I mean, when we saw this whole thing happening in real time, and when we started off, you'd have to go down, a dirt road an hour and a half off any paved highway to find that master. Now that same master might be working in a grocery store over here in Belmont or somewhere here, which is where we found him. Mm-hmm. So it really makes us ask ourselves, what is heritage? Mm-hmm. What is identity? What does belonging mean in this world where there's so much motion? We hear a lot about gentrification of neighborhoods. A lot of people talk about the Mission District having lost its Latino soul. We've been seeing people leave the Mission District for 30 years, coming to places like Richmond, San Pablo, Stockton, Modesto, right? My argument is follow the people, right? But everybody has their own way to address it. But the question is, in coming in, as we keep on going into this century, how do we then start addressing issues of culture? And for us, it's been about really going deeper and deeper into the layers of culture. Some of my students may not speak Spanish. What then connects them to culture? Well, it's the motions, it's the bowing, it's the gestures, it's the smells, it's the sounds, it's the sights. All these things are in constant evolution. So it's really kind of looking deeply at what culture is and how it functions in our life. That to me is a very important exercise, especially now in a time of mass migration.
Stacey, you work in the arts, and the arts is like really fixated on objects, but you cast a whole different kind of light on the objects, that you're talking about how they fit together as part of this wholeness, this sort of worldview. That hat making is related to pole making, is related to arrowheads, is related to canoe making, and that kind of thing. Can you talk a little bit more about how in your work you try to bring these fragments back together for folks, and what the result of that is? What comes together for folks?
I mean, a lot of it is working with outsiders to help them understand the interrelatedness of all of that. But then some of it is also working with community members, you know, because there was so much severing of traditional knowledge. When the residential school system took children out of communities, all of a sudden, you know, the community, the grandparents and the parents had nobody to pass the traditions on to. They were just gone. And they were all taken, you know, unless they were, you know, successfully hidden. But, and so what happened is a loss of knowledge. And so a lot of the recovery has to involve also helping retransmit the traditions and knowledge and languages to this generation of youth that now really want it back. I mean, the intergenerational trauma of the residential school system, you know, you see it in communities where there's high suicide rates and a lot of substance abuse. And, you know, and communities and especially other sort of, how do we stop that? Well, you know, cultural recovery is a really important part of helping stop lower the suicide rates and reconnect people with their cultures to get them well. But also, so part of it is also helping the youth understand what is my culture. So, and creating ways, funding the ways for elders who are really dying out quickly to, do recordings and teach the youth how to speak the languages again, because the languages are an eye to the culture. You can't understand the culture in all the ways it operates unless you have the language. So it's really, when you bring an object home, like a lot of the tears that are shed, the deep emotion that happens when just an object is returned to a community, it's about, well, there was so much harm that went around the taking of that object, and it's the healing process that needs to happen when the object comes home, and then learning around the object. So the object comes home, oh, that was at my grandmother's house. And what was that object used for? And so you can go and look at the object and learn about the songs that went with the object when it was danced in the ceremonies. And then the songs tell the stories. And so it's a reconnecting, finding those stories and songs in the museum, the archives, and learning about the tradition. So yeah, and it's all connected to wellness, to learning languages.
That seems so consonant with what you're doing, Dee. Like, I mean, I'm just thinking about this last big thing over at Exhibit B, right, where literally everybody's coming together. I mean, you've had folks say, my grandmother lived here, let's paint your grandmother then. Like, really, literally conjure her back up. And then suddenly, you've kind of conjured to tens of thousands of people showing up, including singers, including Erica Blue. I mean, it seems like that's kind of a parallel type of process happening in real time. Is that something that you had planned on, or is it something that kind of came together as a part of your practice, as a part of your exploration?
No, I think it definitely, we went into all of those, or the first two projects, with no real gauge of what it could be. Basically, it was a response. It was a way in which we saw a removal of a voice, and it was a response to say, okay, if I'm being silenced, then this is the loudest way I can respond. And I think that's what a lot of the motivation was, to say, okay, you know, this is our weapon, if you will. This paint or this can or this wheat paste or whatever is our weapon to respond against this wiping out. And I think that's what the return ended up being. It became this, we didn't have the patience to write petitions to the government and say this needs to be this, or we didn't have the money to, you know, go in and start rebuilding, but we did have time and we had some skill, I guess, and I think that's what the result of it was. But I think it definitely was from the perspective of understanding what was happening. I don't think we could have done that had we went in with the concept that, oh, we just want to make this pretty, or we just want to make pretty pictures. I think people responded in the way that they did because there was the approach of authenticity in it, you know what I mean? We didn't silence the voices of those that were present. We didn't, when people walk by curious, it wasn't like, oh, this is a closed door. Like, no, this is you can't sit with us.
There's a police who closed the door later.
Yeah, definitely.
Forced you to close the
We
door.
were mad welcoming. We saw somebody walk by, they were curious. We said, come join, come talk, come, you know what I mean? So I think that's what created that, because in New Orleans, people are particularly skeptical and jaded because we've seen and experienced over years, you know, we're a port city, so we've seen many people come in and take what we had and run. So people are generally guarded with what they see. And a lot of people at first were curious to the point of, who are y'all, what are y'all doing? And it took for me to sit people down and be like, yo, and for them to kind of understand. So yeah, I think that was a way in which we were able to navigate and understand how to be truthful in articulating the voices of those that are present and not trying to just speak for them. You know what I mean?
Absolutely. I have a question actually, and then we'll bring it, I want to open it up. But I want to go to you, Eugene, first. We've been talking about community being this sort of driving force at the heart, culture being at the heart, the driving force of creating community. And then that this particular process then has this impact larger in the world. And so I wanted to ask you, Eugene, in terms of thinking about yourself as an individual musician on this journey, rethinking, learning, bringing these practices in, and then creating a cultural center where these ideas, these practices, these sounds, dances, songs are transmitted to kids, and then also your practices being a band leader and being on tour and working with musicians in the popular culture and sort of extending that. How do you think of what it is that you're doing having impact beyond the center, beyond San Pablo, beyond the East Bay, out in the larger world?
Well, there's a lot to be said. I'm third generation. My grandparents came from Mexico about 100 years ago. So I grew up Mexican American. I grew up speaking mostly English. I learned Spanish in school. I don't even speak it that well. Here I am doing a Mexican Arts Center. But for me, it was a process. Growing up, first of all, there's no Mexicans on television. There still aren't any. But back in the 70s, you had white people playing our roles. You couldn't find authentic culture. Everything was very removed from folk music. It was all kind of highly glossed. So for me, starting Sensoles back in the 80s was a process of just getting connected to my roots. And at the same time, there was a revival movement happening in Mexico of rural musicians, which was very important. My students were Mexican-American kids, primarily English-speaking. They listened to rock and rap. Getting them to listen to Mexican music was like giving them cough syrup. They liked it, but it was kind of like, okay, this is good for me. But what happened in the 90s is that the immigrants just started pouring in. And usually when immigrants come in, they kind of tiptoe and they kind of like hide. But there were so many of them, they weren't hiding. They were wearing their boots and they were wearing their hats and they were dancing cabarita and they had banda music blaring out of their car stereos. So what I saw, what I was trying to do in my way, kind of here, it was happening in the street. So getting to your question, I knew that we needed to connect to that because popular regional Mexican culture is just a step away from folk music. It's just kind of repackaged a little bit. So these kids wanted to learn to play it. They wanted their own bandas. There's all these neighborhood bandas, clarinets, trombones, trumpets, and all these kids wanted to come in and start taking lessons. So, I just got our kids to start becoming teachers. They were 15, 16 years old. You know how to dance quebradita. You're the teacher now. Okay, so, I had to learn how to be a little more disciplined, but, that was kind of the deal. They had the heart, they had the core.
Yeah.
So for me, it's all about expanding the network. Sometimes in academia, especially with folk music, it's all about narrowing the categories. But for me, it was all about expanding. And as a Mexican American, there's all these other influences. Los Lobos. Got to work with Los Lobos. You got to work with Linda Ronstadt. Her hit of the mariachi records back in the 80s were hugely important in the Mexican community. When we took a trip to this little village in indigenous Veracruz, a little village with thatch roofs, they were blasting her music at the festival. This was a phenomenon. So to get people like that was natural. And then to connect with the Creoles in Richmond, to do the Taj Mahal record with the African-American music and the Mexican music, the Irish music with the chieftains. That to me is just all natural because we live in communities where we're all mixed anyway.
How do you think about impact from there to the world? in terms of what you're doing with your work?
I mean, I think it's, I try to gauge impact based on like how many, it's weird because I think it's so important to see yourself reflected. I was saying throughout the talk, like this idea of seeing, just the simple practice of seeing a positive version of yourself in very large scale. I think if anything, the impact has been this thought of just understanding and affirming your identity. You know, I think the whole idea of being an activist or activism is based on the idea of value. And it's a response. You know, if somebody pushes your mom down the stairs, you're gonna respond. Like you're gonna fight back because you understand like innately like, yo, that's not what's up. Like, and I think the idea is when you can create in a person that strong sense of understanding how beautiful they are, then they're not gonna put up with the things that people try to pass off and say, okay, this is how it's supposed to be. You know what I mean? I think that's the issue that we always dealing with. We think that, oh, this is the way it's supposed to be, right? You know, cats chase dogs, dogs chase cats, right? Dogs chase cats, cats chase mice.
That's what George Clinton said. Yeah.
Police kill black people. Like, it's like, that's just the way it is, you know what I mean? But I think when you foster a sense of identity and booster this idea of like how beautiful you are, then you're gonna say, nah, that's not the way it's supposed to be. Like, I know I deserve better. And so for me, that's what the impact looks like to me. It's like this idea that we're creating a culture within the city of people who understand their value. And if anything, the Nikes or the Chris Rocks, the Dave Chappelle's, that just sort of aids in that amplification of that value, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So that's always been the tradition of why art is important. I think if anything, we're countering the idea of art for art's sake. You know what I mean? Like the art that is created in these spaces are art that comes from survival. It comes from, like you said, there wasn't even a word to define art, you know what I mean? Because it was like such an innate part of who we are that it didn't need to be categorized. It didn't need to be partitioned off. It was like, this is survival technology, and I think that's what we're just trying to create.
Yeah. So I'm just thinking individual to the community, to the communities, to nations, to society. One of the things that's striking me about your work, Stacey, is that you literally have a picture of a family that is working in cultural practices and traditions and innovating. Obviously, the daughter is thinking of things differently than the way her father and her grandfather did. And I guess the question I have is, what does it look like when you're reaching up to this level, to UN treaties and this kind of level in terms of thinking about the importance of creating community through culture? What does that look like? And do you think that it can have that kind of reach, the kind of work that you're doing?
So, I think one of the best moments as a teacher here was when I had a student come to me in office hours and say to me, wow. So the course, the Indigenous Heritage course I created, I wanted to really flip the paradigm, and so I went around the world and I interviewed Native peoples around the world, and I brought them into the classroom. And all the subjects are taught from the Indigenous perspective. So the readings are from Indigenous writers, and the speakers are Indigenous speakers from around the world on various different subjects. And so some of them are from New Zealand, the Maori, the colonialism happened in similar ways in a lot of places, and the suppression and the trauma happened in similar ways. And the student came to me in office hours and said, wow, I had no idea that the problems that I've had, in my own community on my reservation are so similar to the problems that the Maori experienced. And wow, so I was going to go home and work on rights issues at home, but I think maybe I'm going to be an activist on the international stage because I feel like I can have an impact and help out on the international stage. And I said, well, that's great. I mean, it's great to go home and do your work too. Don't put that out of your mind because that's important. But yeah, you're right. You can have an impact on the international stage. And so the course really tries to get students to understand that at tribal levels, at national levels, and at international levels, there are these frameworks that all need adjusting, and they all need to be modified and improved, and you're the people that can do it. So yeah, you're powerful.
Thank you. Okay, we have about 15 minutes. Any comments, questions, thoughts, anything? Yes, please stand up, say your name, please. And your question.
My name is Dory. So my question is for Brandon. And I'm just kind of curious because so I'm from Miami, and Miami would have this neighborhood called Goodwood. That originally was called like El Barrio, and there was a lot of like Puerto Rican Haitians, and like it was just a lot of color in the community. And they started sort of like a similar project in Goodwood where they started like kind of like having art on all the walls to sort of like, I guess to have themselves put up, and especially as people were being pushed out. And then that kind of got co-opted, and what it is today right now is just like extremely gentrified. Like my family, in the last 5 years, has had to move like 10 blocks each time just because the rent keeps going up and up. And right now it's like San Francisco, and a lot of the new artists that are coming in. Just wondering if like you've taken into consideration how that is like a repeated pattern when sort of like these murals start coming up in spaces, and sort of like if you've thought about like how to tackle that.
And it's also happening in North Miami now too, right? Little Haiti.
Yeah.
I think that's definitely like a cautionary tale. I think globally or even nationally, we're dealing with this like appreciation of street art. It's definitely correlated with like selfie culture. This idea where people like are excited about public art, like they want to see it, they're excited about it, it draws people in. And I think if anything, was part of the caution with like Exhibit B. Like the cautionary tale for us was like we didn't want people to come in here thinking that this was just a fun, cool art thing that they could just take selfies. Like we wanted to be confrontational in a way where and actually one of the compliments that I received from a person who I felt was like the worst thing I heard from a person, who was a friend of mine. I'd known him for a while, this is a white guy, and he told me, his compliment of Exhibit B was like, I like that it was so welcoming, that you had all this stuff with it, I didn't feel uncomfortable. And I was like, dang, you really didn't get it because you were supposed to be uncomfortable. But the idea was that we wanted to be as confrontational about what we painted as possible. To one of the rooms, you had to literally step over a mound of items that enslaved people had to pick. It was from dirt to cotton to peanuts to indigo that was laid on the ground. So the process was in hopes that we would force people to not escape the presence of where they were. And even moving forward in New Orleans, as public art is becoming more and more of a thing that people are accepting, that is part of the policing of it, if you will. You know, like, which is courageous still at this point, that there are people in New Orleans that are policing what happens. They're like, yo, this that went up on this wall is not in concert with what the culture is or what we feel deserves to be up on the wall. And I think there has to be that level of truth in it, you know what I mean? Like, we all like pretty pictures of like whatever, but if it's not truthful to what the space represents, then I feel like it doesn't deserve to be there. I like to think of public art as a collaboration. Like, you can't treat the walls like they're blank surfaces. You have to collaborate with what it is. And if you're not, then it's not authentic. But I do feel like in New Orleans, we're experiencing it from a space where there are a lot of people that's not afraid to cover stuff up if they feel like it's inappropriate. Perfect story that just happened. I mean, with this, there's this artist. I don't mind putting her name up there. Her name is Muck Rock. That's what she writes on and stuff, right? And she recently found her way in New Orleans, and she was like, she's gonna paint all these murals everywhere. And she's kind of like arrogant in the way she does it, because she says her murals are a gift to the community, so people can't be upset about it because she normally gets paid for this. So her doing it is a gift. And she painted. Right after Fats Domino died, she painted a portrait of Fats Domino on the side of a house, and then as big as his face was her name, Muck Rock. And there was an immediate response where it didn't last long. Like, there were people who went in and covered it up. And then she painted she's mad troubles. Like, she painted like a gorilla with like bling on his, like a grill, and like people covered that up. Like, literally now everything she touches, no matter what it is, it's like somebody's covering it up. So I think, I mean, I don't want to like censor her art as an artist, but that's necessary in the context of community. Like, you live there, you know what I mean? Like, that's what we tell people, like, I'm gonna paint this and bounce, but you live here. So I don't want to just come in your space and hang up something on your wall. Like, I want to talk, I want to build, I want to learn. Say it.
My name is Noah. I guess my question is, how do you create a culture that is resilient against the forces that are oppressive on art and community and culture?
For me, we work with kids, and the most important thing that I feel we need to give to our children is the constant message that this is your land. And one of my students, she posted something on Facebook about how she felt that this country was not her country. And I kind of scolded her. I said, I don't want you to ever say that. So I see myself as a custodian of our country, our land. And I put that in my songs, and we teach that to our children. They are the hosts of our center. They are the centers of their lives. And it's very, very important that we do that. That's not to say that we don't learn the traumas of our history, but we also have to celebrate the beauty and the joy and the love that exists also within our heritage.
Stacy?
Well,
Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I completely agree with that, and that's something that comes along with recovering objects, but I also tell the young people, and there's a lot of talk of this in universities too. It's okay to be angry, so don't tell yourself that you're not allowed to be angry and you have to just be happy.
There's always been this line of brilliance that has always been the part that couldn't be erased. You know what I mean? It was like in the midst of these very ill and very ugly moments, the culture has always been this line that was the line of hope. So I feel as though the deeper argument could they exist without each other? Like could culture in a way, and we've been talking about this with some friends, like could we maintain the brilliance without the view of oppression? You know what I mean? Could we keep what we have without the threat of always knowing that someone doesn't want it to be there? You know what I mean? And the challenge with culture in general, the challenge with like the culture creators is that they are alchemists. They've turned the lead into gold. And the challenge is that everyone wants gold. Mm-hmm. And so what we see, what I've heard from what you were saying is this idea that people saw gold in a space where other people just saw what was culture, which was normal, but others saw gold and they wanted that. That's what we're dealing with in New Orleans, where we have like a $7 trillion industry that is New Orleans tourism or Louisiana tourism. It's $7 trillion, yet the average culture bearer makes $15,000 a year. Wow. So there's this huge discrepancy, which is widely reported, but it's a constant theme that lets us understand that it was never created for that purpose. Culture did never exist, which is why I have problems with cities like LA, where everything is created for a price. No this to LA or anybody from there. But so anyway, to answer your question, I do feel like culture has always been that theme that makes us human in the midst of all the things that tell us we're not. You know what I mean? So with that in mind, I don't have any fear that, not fear, I shouldn't say. I feel as though as much as the pressure gets tighter, the culture is going to still keep coming out in more and more beautiful ways. So yeah.
Eugene?
And I think it's really important that we maintain our voice at the table.
Yeah.
Ever since I started my little organization, I said I don't want to sit with the advocates who are speaking for me. I want to sit at the table with the big boys, and I always fought for that. Recently, I wrote a song about dreamers. Mm-hmm. A lot of our people are undocumented. And I wrote it with Jackson Brown. Obviously, he has a very different point of view about the situation, but I insisted when we did the video of the song that we speak in the affirmative. That when we did our video, we weren't going to fetishize our fear, because most of the undocumented that I know, they're kind of pissed off. They're not even feeling. They said, "Look, this is not going to stop me from living my life." So it was very important to me that we fought for the image of our film to be about us fully integrated, not fetishized, exoticized. Wearing our Mexican hats, No, you're going to live like the way we live, fully integrated into society, doing what we do. And that's the backdrop of the song. So I think that's about always putting ourselves forward the way we want to see ourselves. Because we have that responsibility because our kids are looking at us.
Please join me in thanking our guests, D-Mike.